Helen shuffled down the wide aisles of the nearly empty Walmart, her cane tapping rhythmically on the linoleum floor. It was the only sound accompanying the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. She moved slowly the way she always did, taking her time, feeling the weight of every item she picked up, as if each one held a secret, something only she could understand. Her frail hands, pale and veined, traced the edges of a box of clock radios before placing it gently back on the shelf. Tonight was no different from any other night. She had become a familiar face to the late-night employees, though they rarely spoke more than a polite hello as she wandered through the store. Helen's insomnia had driven her to Walmart at odd hours for months now, seeking solace in the bright, unchanging aisles. There was something comforting in their order, in the way nothing ever seemed to change, no matter how long she lingered. But tonight was different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows at the far end of the store seemed deeper than usual. As she meandered through the electronics section, her eyes were drawn to a display of old-fashioned clocks. Each one ticked at a slightly different pace, the off-kilter rhythm growing louder in her mind. She stared at them, mesmerized by their relentless ticking, unaware that time was slipping away from her in a very different way. Suddenly, a distant voice crackled over the store's intercom. "Attention Walmart shoppers, the store will be closing in 10 minutes. Please make your way to the front for checkout." The words barely registered with Helen. Her tired eyes remained locked on the clocks, their tiny hands crawling forward, marking each passing second. Her breathing was slow, her heartbeat steady, as if synced with the clocks themselves. 10 minutes came and went. The lights in the store flickered once, just for a moment, but long enough to pull Helen out of her trance. She blinked, confused, and glanced around. The store was silent, too silent. No sound of distant footsteps from other customers, no murmuring of employees chatting among themselves as they prepared to close up. She began to walk toward the front of the store, but something felt wrong. The aisles stretched out ahead of her like an endless maze. She quickened her pace, her cane tapping louder and faster as she approached the front entrance. The automatic doors, those reassuring sliding glass doors that always greeted her, remained stubbornly shut. She waved her hand in front of the sensor, but nothing happened. She pressed her hands against the cool glass and peered outside. The parking lot was empty, not a single car or person in sight. The store was closed. Helen knocked softly at first, then harder, the sharp sound echoing in the cavernous store. But no one was there to hear her. The realization washed over her. She was locked in, forgotten. A nervous chuckle escaped her lips. It was a mistake, surely. They would notice soon, wouldn't they? One of the employees would realize she was still inside and come back for her. They had to. But as she turned away from the door and glanced back into the darkened aisles, the familiar warmth of the store began to drain away. The hum of the lights overhead grew faint, almost distant, like it was receding. The shelves, once orderly and welcoming, now loomed over her like towering walls in a prison, their sharp edges casting long, unnatural shadows. Helen shivered, though the temperature hadn't changed. The store felt different. Not empty, but something far worse, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. She was not alone. Helen stood frozen by the glass doors, staring into the vast empty parking lot. The silence weighed heavy on her, sinking deep into her bones. Her heart, which had been a steady drumbeat of irritation at being forgotten, began to quicken, tinged now with a hint of fear. She turned back to the store, hoping to spot a familiar face, a late-night employee returning for something they'd forgotten. But there was no one. The faint hum of the overhead lights became oppressive, a constant reminder of the isolation surrounding her. Her cane trembled slightly in her hand as she ventured deeper into the aisles, each step echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The store was massive, and despite having spent countless nights wandering through it, tonight the space felt foreign, cold, and unfamiliar. The aisles stretched endlessly, their contents casting strange shadows that moved in the corners of her eyes. As she passed through the clothing section, a faint noise broke the stillness. The squeak of a shopping cart's wheels. It was distant but unmistakable. Helen paused, squinting into the dimly lit rows of clothes. There, at the far end of the aisle, she saw it, a lone shopping cart, slightly swaying as if someone had just pushed it. "Hello?" Her voice wavered in the air, swallowed by the store's cavernous silence. No answer. She swallowed, her throat dry, and approached the cart, her shoes squeaking faintly against the floor. The cart was motionless by the time she reached it. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of another person. There was none, just racks of clothes hanging limply and the cart sitting still in the eerie half-light. Helen's breath quickened. She gripped the cart, steadying herself, when something clattered to the ground behind her. The sound was sharp, metallic, and immediate, like something falling from a shelf. She spun around, her cane slipping slightly on the floor. Several canned goods had toppled from a nearby shelf and rolled across the floor, coming to a stop near her feet. The cans hadn't just fallen, they'd been pushed. Helen's pulse raced as she scanned the aisle. The cold, sterile light from the ceiling flickered, casting momentary shadows that twisted and stretched. Her eyes darted from one shelf to another, her breathing growing shallow. Something was wrong. The store was playing tricks on her, or no, it couldn't be. Whispers, faint and distant, like the sound of breath against her ear. At first, she thought it was the hum of the lights, but no, the whisper was real, distinct, and chillingly familiar. "Helen," the voice said, soft but clear. Her entire body stiffened, the sound of her name sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no one there. She moved faster now, hobbling down the next aisle, her cane tapping faster as her panic grew. The store felt alive, watching her. Shelves loomed taller than she remembered, their contents unnaturally still, as if holding their breath. Helen's grip tightened on her cane as she hurried through the aisles, desperate for an exit, desperate for any sign of help. But the whispers followed her. "Helen!" they called, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Her name echoed through the electronics section, bouncing off the silent screens of TVs and stereos. She covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it burrowed into her mind, soft and persistent. She passed by a large curved mirror, one of those security mirrors placed high in the corners of stores to offer a view of hidden aisles. In the distorted reflection, she caught a glimpse of something behind her. At first, it was just a shadow, an odd flicker of movement. But as she looked closer, the figure became clearer. A woman standing unnaturally still at the far end of the aisle, staring directly at Helen with eyes that seemed hollow, empty, and wrong. Helen turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one. Only the empty aisle stretching out into the gloom. A chill ran down her spine. She took a step back, her reflection catching her eye again. The figure was gone from the mirror, but the feeling of being watched clung to her like a cold fog. Desperate for answers, she stumbled toward the back of the store, drawn to a storage area that had always seemed strange to her. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room cluttered with old, forgotten merchandise. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed. In the corner of the room, something caught her eye, an old newspaper, yellowed and brittle with age. She picked it up with trembling hands, the faded ink barely readable. The headline sent a jolt of terror through her. "Woman found dead in Walmart after being locked in overnight." Helen's breath hitched as she read on. The article described a tragedy that had occurred when the store first opened. A woman, a shopper like Helen, had been forgotten inside and locked in for days. By the time they found her, she had died of exposure. The employees hadn't noticed until it was too late. And since then, strange occurrences had plagued the store during the late-night hours. Customers reported seeing her, hearing her, whispers in the aisles, objects moving on their own. Helen's hands shook, the newspaper slipping from her grip and fluttering to the floor. The woman had been left behind, forgotten, just like her. And she was still here. The lights flickered violently, plunging the store into near darkness. Helen felt a sudden, overwhelming presence behind her. Cold and angry, she didn't dare turn around. The whispers grew louder. "Helen, you've come for me." Helen's heart pounded in her chest as the store plunged into flickering shadows. The sound of the whisper, her name, over and over, grew louder, more insistent, like a voice pushing through the walls of her mind. She backed away from the storage room, her cane tapping frantically as she stumbled back into the aisles. But the space around her felt tighter, more claustrophobic. The shelves seemed to loom larger, bending inward like they were closing in on her, trapping her within their grasp. "Helen!" The voice was closer now, just behind her. She spun around, her eyes wild, but there was no one, just the endless aisles stretching in every direction. Her breathing was ragged, the sound of it deafening in the crushing silence. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but fear drove her onward. She had to escape. She had to. As she hurried through the store, the air grew colder. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the dim light. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that twisted and writhed along the shelves. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she swore she saw movement, shapes darting in the periphery of her vision. A soft, unsettling laugh echoed in the distance, sending a wave of nausea through her. She reached the electronics section again, desperate for any sign of a way out. The TVs along the wall flickered to life as she approached, their screens showing static and distorted images. She stared at them, her reflection staring back in the chaotic blur of pixels. But then something changed. The screen on one TV began to clear, the static resolving into a grainy image. At first, it showed the empty aisles of Walmart, like a security camera feed. But then, Helen saw herself wandering the store, panicked, lost, just as she had been moments ago. Her pulse quickened as she watched herself in real time, hobbling through the aisles, looking over her shoulder in terror. But then something else appeared in the frame. Behind her reflection, the figure of a woman emerged, pale, gaunt, and drenched in shadow. The ghostly woman moved silently behind Helen, her cold eyes locked onto her back. Helen gasped and turned away from the screen, spinning around, expecting to see the figure in real life. But she was alone. Her reflection, however, told a different story. On the TV, the ghostly woman stood inches behind her, one skeletal hand reaching out toward her shoulder. Helen stumbled backward, her gaze darting between the TV screens and the empty space behind her. The ghost wasn't just haunting the store, she was inside the reflections, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the TVs all around her flickered and distorted. Dozens of her own reflections stared back at her from every screen, their faces twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror. But behind every version of Helen, the ghostly figure loomed closer, reaching out from the shadows like she was trying to drag Helen into the screen. Desperate, Helen turned and ran, her cane clattering against the floor as she pushed herself faster than her frail body should have allowed. The aisles blurred past her, the shelves warping into unfamiliar shapes. But the store itself seemed to turn against her. Every corner she rounded brought her back to the same place, the same aisles, the same suffocating feeling that the store was bending in on itself. The voice was louder now, closer, right next to her ear. "Helen, stay with me." Helen's chest tightened with panic. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, as if they weren't her own anymore. She reached the front of the store again, slamming her hands against the glass doors. But no matter how hard she pushed or screamed, the doors remained shut. She was trapped. She turned back, her back pressed against the cold glass. The store was unnaturally still now, the shadows stretching into grotesque, towering shapes that seemed to swallow the aisles whole. Then she saw her. The ghostly woman stepped out from the aisle, fully formed now. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and devoid of life. She wore an old dress, one that seemed out of place in the modern store, the fabric tattered and faded, as if it had been trapped in the same forgotten loop as her soul. Helen's breath hitched as the woman advanced, her movements slow, deliberate. There was no rush. She had all the time in the world. The lights flickered again, and for a moment everything was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the ghost stood just a few feet from Helen. Her face was twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. "You're not leaving," the ghost whispered, her voice cold and final. "You never were." Helen collapsed to the floor, her back pressed against the doors, her hands trembling. She begged, pleaded, but the ghost's smile only widened, her eyes gleaming with something far worse than hatred. It was satisfaction. The ghost stepped forward, kneeling beside Helen, but instead of attacking, she reached out, her fingers gently brushing against Helen's cheek. It was a cold, deathly touch, and Helen felt her body seize up with fear. Then, in a terrifying twist, the ghost whispered in Helen's ear one final time, "You're one of us now." Helen's reflection in the glass door began to distort, her own face twisted, her skin sagging, her eyes hollowing out. She screamed, but no sound came from her lips. The reflection was no longer hers, it belonged to the ghost. And as Helen stared, she realized the truth. She wasn't escaping, she was becoming her. With one final tortured scream, Helen's reflection faded entirely, replaced by the hollow-eyed, ghostly woman. The real Helen slumped to the floor, her body going limp, her spirit trapped inside the store's twisted maze of reflections. The story opens with an expansive shot of the Walmart parking lot at midnight, bathed in a ghostly light from the full moon. The sprawling retail giant stands alone, its bright neon sign flickering like a warning beacon in the darkness. A chill wind rustles through the empty shopping carts, creating an unsettling sound that echoes across the lot. As the camera zooms in, we see Mark, a weary man in his 30s, approach the entrance with a mix of hope and trepidation. Once inside, Mark is greeted by a deafening silence that fills the enormous store. The fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting harsh, sterile beams that illuminate the aisles. But the shadows between them seem to stretch unnaturally, giving the impression that they are alive. Mark pushes his cleaning cart forward, the squeak of the wheels a sharp contrast to the stillness around him. He tries to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the eerie quiet amplifies every little sound, the distant hum of refrigeration units, the clattering of cans that seem to tumble from nowhere. Mark's first task is to clean the restrooms, a duty he approaches with reluctance. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead as he scrubs away at the grimy tiles, his own reflection in the mirrors staring back at him, eyes wide with fatigue and anxiety. He tries to focus on the job at hand, but the quiet is oppressive, and he starts hearing things. A faint scurrying sound from somewhere behind the walls, almost like whispering. Shaking off the nerves, he assures himself that it's just the building settling. As the clock inches toward midnight, the aging janitor, Carl, enters the restroom. His presence is both reassuring and unsettling. With graying hair and a permanent frown, he seems to carry the weight of many nights spent in the store. He gives Mark a brief nod, but there's a heaviness in the air. Carl leans closer, his voice low and conspiratorial, as if afraid of being overheard. "Stick to the well-lit aisles, kid," he warns. "And whatever you do, don't go near aisle 17 after midnight. You hear me?" Mark laughs it off as a joke, but Carl's serious expression chills him. As Carl leaves, the atmosphere shifts. Mark resumes his cleaning, but now every little noise makes his heart race. He can't shake off Carl's warning, and the shadows seem to deepen in the aisles. He hears faint scraping sounds, maybe just a cart rolling away, but they seem to echo in the cavernous space. Mark glances toward aisle 17, a dark, forbidding corridor at the end of the store. Something about it feels wrong. The lights flicker more violently, as if they're struggling to maintain their glow. With every passing minute, Mark's unease grows. He tries to push the creeping dread aside, focusing on his tasks, but he can't ignore the feeling that he's not alone. Every flicker of light feels like a warning, and the unsettling noises increase. Distant thuds, the shuffle of feet that sound too heavy for a store that should be empty. He finishes up and tries to rationalize his fear, telling himself it's just the nerves of a new job. Yet, as he cleans, he feels the weight of eyes watching him from the darkened aisles. As Mark continues his shift, the store transforms from a mundane workplace into a sinister maze. The fluorescent lights flicker more frequently, casting long, disorienting shadows that seem to reach out and grasp at him as he walks. Mark wipes the sweat from his brow, glancing at the digital clock above the customer service desk. It's past 1 a.m., and he feels the weight of the night pressing in on him. The air is thick with an unshakable sense of dread. With each passing hour, the noises grow more pronounced. The faint sounds of scuffling and scraping echo through the aisles like whispers from the walls. Mark dismisses them as nothing more than his imagination, but the anxiety gnaws at him. The sounds seem to come from aisle 17, and despite Carl's warning, Mark's curiosity begins to bubble to the surface. He reminds himself that he's just cleaning, that he needs to finish his shift. As he mops the floor in the grocery section, Mark notices something out of place. A large, overturned display of cereal, the boxes strewn across the floor, as if someone had knocked them down in a hurry. He glances around, but there's no one in sight. The hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He pushes the cart past the scattered boxes, the eerie quiet weighing heavily on him. The sense that something is lurking just beyond the flickering light grows stronger. Despite his better judgment, Mark finds himself drawn to aisle 17. The darkness seems thicker there, almost palpable. He takes a deep breath, clenching the handle of his mop like a weapon, and steps closer. As he peers down the aisle, the fluorescent lights flicker erratically, illuminating shelves stacked with items that seem to loom over him like silent sentinels. The air grows colder, and he can feel a strange pull urging him to step inside. In the dim light, Mark spots something, a shadow darting between the shelves. His heart races as he strains to see, but it disappears before he can get a good look. The noises intensify, almost mocking him. He can hear the sound of claws scratching against the tile, rhythmic and deliberate. Suddenly, a loud crash echoes through the aisle and Mark jumps back, adrenaline surging through his veins. He knows he should leave, but his feet feel rooted to the spot, the compulsion to uncover the truth overwhelming. As Mark inches into aisle 17, he trips over a discarded box, sending it clattering to the ground. He steadies himself and looks up to see what he's done. Then he sees it, a dark figure hunched over in the shadows, partially obscured by the shelves. The figure is not entirely human. Its skin looks stretched and pallid, glistening under the flickering lights. It seems to be gnawing on something, the sound grotesque and primal. The realization hits him like a punch to the gut. This is not just some drifter. This is a predator. Mark stumbles backward, and the creature snaps its head toward him, eyes glinting with a wild, feral hunger. The fear that floods his veins is paralyzing. It stands up, towering over Mark, revealing a frame that is both emaciated and muscular, as if it has been living off whatever it can find in the shadows of the store. With every ounce of instinct telling him to run, he turns to flee, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Mark races back through the aisles, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind him, growing louder and more frantic. He can feel its breath on his neck, hot and rancid. Panic floods his mind as he navigates the shelves, knocking over displays in a desperate attempt to slow it down. The store, once so familiar, now twists and turns into a nightmare, every aisle a potential trap. He glances over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of the creature's outstretched claw, ready to strike. He darts into the electronics section, ducking behind a display of TVs, breathing heavily. The screens flicker with images, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Mark's mind races as he searches for an escape. He hears the creature prowling nearby. It growls a low, rumbling sound that sends chills down his spine. The once comforting glow of the store now feels like a false light, exposing him to danger. Mark's heart races as he realizes he may not make it out of this store alive. Mark crouches behind the display of TVs, heart pounding in his chest, the echoes of the creature's footsteps growing fainter, but still dangerously close. He holds his breath, listening intently. The eerie silence is punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigeration units. But beneath that, he can hear something. A low, guttural sound, a combination of snarl and growl. He realizes it's not just a creature, it's a person who has descended into madness. With adrenaline coursing through him, Mark carefully inches out from his hiding spot, scanning the aisles for a way to escape. His mind races as he thinks of the exits, but every route seems fraught with peril. The normal sounds of the store feel amplified and distorted, each little creak and shuffle heightening his anxiety. He knows he can't stay hidden forever, but the thought of confronting the deranged man sends waves of dread crashing over him. Mark moves cautiously toward the back of the store where he remembers the employee break room is located. As he passes through the frozen food section, he spots something horrifying. The shadow of the disfigured man flickering in the dim light, rummaging through boxes. Mark's heart drops as he realizes the man is scavenging, looking for food, but also for something else, his next victim. It's then that Mark sees the man's face, twisted and gaunt, with wild eyes that seem to search for prey. Mark quickly turns away, retreating deeper into the store, but he knows he must find a weapon to defend himself. He remembers the janitorial closet. If he can just reach it, He might find something to fight back with. He races toward the back of the store, ducking low to stay out of sight. Each step feels like a countdown to his own demise, the heavy silence punctuated by the thumping of his heart. He reaches the janitorial closet and fumbles with the keys, his hands trembling. Finally, he unlocks the door and steps inside, grabbing a heavy-duty mop and a bucket filled with soapy water. The mop feels flimsy, but it's better than nothing. He also finds a small fire extinguisher, which he grabs as an afterthought. If it comes to a confrontation, he'll need to be ready. Just as he's about to leave the closet, he hears the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Mark's breath catches in his throat as he presses himself against the wall, praying the darkness will conceal him. He peeks through the door's crack, seeing the deranged man enter the aisle, looking for him. Sniffing the air like an animal, the man's movements are erratic, almost feral, and Mark feels a wave of nausea wash over him. When the man finally wanders closer, Mark takes a deep breath and bursts out of the closet, aiming the fire extinguisher at him. "Get back!" he shouts, spraying the man with a cloud of white foam. The man staggers backward, momentarily disoriented. Mark seizes the opportunity, rushing past him toward the exit. But the deranged man recovers quickly, rage in his eyes. He charges after Mark, who runs for his life. The store feels like an endless labyrinth as Mark zigzags through the aisles, desperate to reach the front doors. The sound of the man's heavy footsteps echoes behind him, urging him to run faster. Panic floods his mind as he rounds a corner and comes face to face with a dead end, a wall of shelves stacked high. With nowhere to go, Mark spins around just as the man catches up to him. They stand locked in a standoff, the deranged man breathing heavily, eyes wild and manic. "You shouldn't have come here," the man growls, a twisted grin spreading across his face. Mark's mind races as he clutches the fire extinguisher tightly, ready to defend himself. Just then, Carl appears at the entrance, but something is off. He doesn't seem surprised to see the chaos unfolding. Instead, he watches with an unsettling calmness, like a predator observing its prey. Mark's heart sinks as he realizes Carl has been complicit all along, protecting the monster that has claimed this store as its hunting ground. "You should have listened, kid," Carl says coldly, his voice devoid of empathy. "This is just how things are here." Mark turns to Carl, desperation flooding his senses. "Help me, he's going to kill me," he pleads. But Carl remains impassive, a smirk creeping onto his lips. The man takes a step closer, his gaze fixed on Mark. Mark knows that he's outnumbered, and the realization crashes over him. There's no escape from this twisted nightmare. As Mark's heart races, he raises the fire extinguisher, prepared to fight. But the man lunges, and in that split second, everything goes dark. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sounds of struggle and muffled voices echoing in the distance. When the screen lights back up, it's morning. The store is bustling with customers, oblivious to the horror that unfolded overnight. The camera pans over the aisles, now brightly lit, but as it reaches aisle 17, it lingers for a moment longer, catching the glint of a blood-stained mop tucked away behind the shelves, hinting at the darkness that still lingers just beneath the surface. The camera glides through the expansive aisles of Walmart, a labyrinth of towering shelves stocked with goods, all wrapped in an unsettling silence. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting a cold, clinical glow that sharpens shadows into menacing forms. It's just past midnight, the store long emptied of customers, and the only sounds are the muted echoes of distant machinery and the occasional hum of an air vent. Frank and Eddie, two elderly security guards, are stationed at their usual post near the entrance. Frank, with a weathered face and deep-set eyes, carries the weight of his years with a mix of humor and cynicism. Eddie, slightly younger and more spry, sports a shock of gray hair and an easy grin. They've been working together for over a decade, sharing stories and jokes as they navigate the monotony of night shifts. The two exchange lighthearted jabs, reminiscing about their time on the job. "Remember the timing we caught that shoplifter trying to steal a garden gnome?" Frank chuckles, his voice echoing through the empty aisles. Eddie laughs, recounting how they scared the thief off by pretending to be police. Their camaraderie serves as a comforting backdrop against the oppressive stillness of the store. As they make their routine rounds, the atmosphere begins to shift. Frank pushes a cart of supplies through the aisle when he hears a faint rustle behind him. He turns to find a shopping cart inexplicably rolling backward on its own, as if propelled by an unseen force. He brushes it off as a trick of the mind, but Eddie raises an eyebrow, glancing around nervously. The two guards move deeper into the store, only to notice other odd occurrences, items that seem slightly out of place, flickering lights that momentarily plunge them into darkness, and whispers that echo just beyond the threshold of understanding. It's just the wind, Eddie reassures himself, though he can't shake the sensation that they are being watched. While walking through the toy aisle, Frank recounts a local legend he heard from a former guard, a story about a spirit that haunts the store, believed to be the restless soul of a former employee who died in a tragic accident. "You really believe in that stuff?" Eddie scoffs, but there's a nervous edge to his voice. They continue their rounds, dismissing the eeriness with laughter, yet the seed of dread has been planted. As the night wears on, the tension lingers in the air, thickening like fog. Each creak of the building feels amplified, and each corner they turn seems to hide something just out of sight. Their usual banter falters as the strangeness of the night grows. They feel an unsettling presence, an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders, urging them to leave. As the clock strikes 2 a.m., the once familiar aisles of Walmart take on a more sinister aura. The bright fluorescent lights flicker, sporadically casting eerie shadows that dance across the shelves. The air grows heavy, pregnant with an unshakable tension. Frank and Eddie, their nerves frayed, exchange nervous glances as the mundane night shift transforms into something far more sinister. During their rounds, the odd disturbances escalate. Items begin to fall off shelves without explanation. A box of cereal crashes to the floor, followed by a cascade of toys that clatter ominously around them. "Did you see that?" Eddie's voice trembles as he points toward a display that has inexplicably shifted. Frank, trying to maintain composure, nods, but his heart races. They move cautiously, each step echoing loudly in the stillness, their laughter replaced by whispered fears. As they approach the electronics ocean, Eddie feels a chill run down his spine. He freezes, catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure on the security monitor, a fleeting shape that disappears as quickly as it appears. "Did you see that?" he gasps, but Frank is skeptical, attributing it to fatigue. The lingering whispers seem to grow louder, swirling around them like a chilling breeze, tugging at the edges of their sanity. Suddenly, the lights above them flicker violently, plunging the aisle into darkness for a brief moment. When they flicker back on, the atmosphere has shifted. It feels charged, electric, with a malevolence that sends shivers down their spines. Frank turns to Eddie, but he notices that Eddie has gone pale, staring intently at something just beyond his line of sight. "What is it?" Frank asks, anxiety creeping into his voice. Eddie finally manages to speak. There's something over there." He points, and Frank follows his gaze to a shadow that looms at the end of the aisle. The figure seems to be watching them, its shape indistinct but undeniably present. Frank takes a step forward, but a sudden crash of metal against the tile floor sends them both jumping back. The spirit reveals itself, a translucent figure with hollow eyes and an anguished expression. It raises a finger pointing toward a specific aisle as if beckoning them to follow. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, the two guards cautiously approach the aisle the spirit indicated. They can feel the temperature drop, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. As they peer into the aisle, they see nothing but shadows. However, they soon discover a hidden storage room concealed behind a set of shelves cloaked in darkness. Inside the storage room, they find a trove of old, dusty merchandise, forgotten toys, faded promotional signs, and remnants of a bygone era. Among the clutter, they stumble upon a collection of newspaper clippings detailing the tragic death of a former employee, a dedicated worker who had mysteriously vanished one fateful night. As they read, the room grows heavier with the weight of sorrow, and they begin to piece together the story of the spirit haunting the store. Suddenly, the ghost appears before them again, swirling in a whirlwind of lost memories. It screams, a heart-wrenching sound that reverberates through the aisles. Frank and Eddie, frozen in fear, try to communicate with it, but their words are swallowed by the chaos. The spirit seems desperate, its movements frantic as it points toward a dusty box, as if it holds the key to its anguish. As Frank and Eddie stare at the chaotic scene before them, or classy, the air is thick with dread. The spirit, a swirling mass of sorrow and rage, hovers before the dusty box, its ghostly visage flickering like a faulty light bulb. The once familiar Walmart feels like a haunted tomb, the aisles closing in around them as shadows creep along the floor. An overwhelming sense of urgency fills the room. They realize they must understand what the spirit wants if they hope to find peace. With trembling hands, Frank approaches the box, its surface covered in dust and old faded labels. He glances at Eddie, Osium, at Betty, who nods, urging him to continue. As Frank lifts the lid, a gust of cold air bursts forth, as if the box has been holding in a terrible secret for far too long. Inside, they find forgotten trinkets and personal items, a name tag, a small mirror, and an old photo of a smiling young woman. It's the former employee, the one who vanished without a trace. The ghost becomes agitated, swirling around them in a frenzy, its mournful cries echoing through the storage room. Frank and Eddie begin to piece together the haunting. The woman had been wronged, her fate tied to this very place. In their desperation to help, they plead with the spirit to show them what happened, their hearts racing as the atmosphere grows more oppressive. Suddenly, they are transported into a vivid flashback, the storage room dissolving around them. They see the woman, Lucy, working late at the store, cheerful and dedicated. But then, the vision darkens. They witness her being confronted by a shadowy figure, a former manager who had harbored dark intentions. The confrontation escalates, and Lucy's face twists with fear as she realizes she's trapped. The vision shifts abruptly, showing Lucy's desperate attempt to escape, her spirit trapped in the very aisles they now patrol. As the vision fades, Frank and Eddie find themselves back in the storage room, the ghost now hovering before them, its anguish palpable. They realize Lucy needs justice. Her story must be told. "We'll help you," Frank shouts, desperation in his voice. But the spirit grows furious, the lights flickering wildly, and the shelves rattling violently as it reacts to their promise. It seems to be warning them that they're running out of time. With the chaos intensifying, Frank and Eddie make a hasty decision. They sprint toward the security office, desperate to review the security footage from that fateful night. They pull up the grainy video, and their hearts race as they witness Lucy's final moments, her fear and the shadows that loom behind her, the figure that had taken her life. Just as they piece together the truth, the spirit reappears, now more furious than ever, its face contorted in rage. Frank and Eddie, cornered, understand that the spirit won't rest until it's avenged. As the chaos unfolds, the very foundations of the store seem to tremble, the aisles warping around them as they confront the truth. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened to you," Eddie yells. But the spirit is relentless, thrashing in agony as it tries to convey its desperate need for closure. In a final burst of energy, the spirit lunges at them, engulfing the room in darkness. The camera cuts to black, leaving only the sound of Frank and Eddie's frantic breathing. When the screen fades back in, it's morning. The store is bustling with customers, completely unaware of the horror that unfolded overnight. Frank and Eddie are nowhere to be found, their absence a chilling reminder of the night's events.